Welcome to Kevin Makes Cool Things. I'm Kevin, and this is my Cartenon Temple key. This is the key which Jinwoo uses when he returns to the Double Dungeon, which is a big moment in the series. My process started by finding references, which meant I got distracted and reread a few dozen chapters while I was at it. Surprisingly, we don't actually see much of this item. We first see it in chapter 111, right at the start of season 2 when they're teasing this big moment. And then we see it again in chapters 123 and 124 as Jinwoo is entering the Double Dungeon. Overall, there's only 5 decent images of this. When looking at these, I noticed there's basically 2 versions of the key. The first is from chapter 111, where it looks very blocky. This is the same design we see in chapter 123. The second version we only see in chapter 124. It has a much sharper, more curving design. These inconsistencies aren't unusual for manga and manhwa, especially for solo leveling. If you've watched any of my other solo leveling videos, you'll know that I've dealt with this on pretty much every project. I've talked about this before, but I generally don't try to copy these props exactly. The artist's role is to make this stuff look awesome, and mine is to try to reproduce it in 3D as faithfully as possible. That sometimes means making creative choices. I decided to do the second version, from chapter 124, with the more curving design. You could make an argument for either, but I thought this one was more in the spirit of the other designs from the series. It feels like a much better fit with the other daggers and weapons from the series than the blocky version does. That's just my logic, and you're welcome to disagree with me in the comments. People have done that on some of the daggers I've made, and it's been a really fun debate to have. After choosing to go with this version, I had 2 options for the reference image. The one on the left has a better view of the teeth of the key, but you can't see the entire thing because of his hand. The one on the right isn't as detailed since it's still in the process of appearing in Jinwoo's hand, but it shows the entire key. I went with the image on the right because it's much easier for me to add details than to outline pieces which aren't visible at all. Recently, I've taken to sketching over props to create a reference for Blender, rather than working directly off of the raw images. I noticed that I would try to jump right into modeling, but then run into issues and have to go back and do this step anyways, so at this point, I've just made it part of my normal process. At this stage, I'm trying to identify the general outline of the key and the defining details. I'm periodically checking other reference images and adding those details in. Not everything is included in this sketch because it doesn't need to be. This will get me 80 to 90% of the way there, and then I'll make the final adjustments in Blender based on how things are looking. Before I started modeling this, I had to set up my reference image. I imported it and created a cube of the right length, then scaled up the reference image until it was about the right size. This isn't perfect, but it's good enough for me. I started with the teeth. These were the most prominent detail, and I wanted to make sure I got them right before moving on to the rest. I use the same approach for this that I use for my daggers and pretty much everything else I make. I trace everything with a plane, extrude that plane, and then adjust the points to create the angled edge if needed. Then I use a subdivision surface modifier and some creased edges to make everything curve nicely. For the shaft of the key, I tried using some cylinders, but it just didn't look quite right. I ended up using a plane to perfectly trace this, and then used a subdivision surface modifier to round it over. It won't be a perfect circle, but it gives me more control and it's going to end up being close enough. I used the same approach for the head of the key that I had used for the teeth. When I was doing this, I realized I'd made it a little bit too small in my sketch, so I did scale it up a little bit. After getting everything roughly in place, I made some slight modifications to get nicer curves. That's one of the things I love about using subdivision surface modifiers. Before moving on, I need to tell you a little side story. This month, I was actually planning to post my build of the Demon King's longsword. I've been trying to branch out from just 3D printing projects for a while, and I've been secretly working on this in the background. About a week before posting this video, I finished version 1 of my sword, and it was one of the worst things I've ever made. You'll see it at some point after I've finished a usable version 2. Suddenly, this project went from something I was casually working on in the background to something I needed to finish as soon as possible. I dove in and added the spikes to the head of the key. Unfortunately, I didn't check the math on these, and it turns out they were only about a half millimeter high, which did become an issue later on. I also went back and added some details I missed on the head of the key. Maybe this is all obvious for those of you watching, but I sometimes misinterpret details. It's not always obvious until I'm in the middle of the project and seeing it in 3D that I realize I have to do some improvised fixes. This is also when I replaced the placeholder details. I had put a cylinder here to check about the sizing, but at this stage I went back and changed it to something more faithful to the original art. I could have attempted to sketch all this originally, but it's easier for me to just tinker with this in Blender. One detail I did have trouble with was the nub behind these two big teeth. I tried a few different things and eventually used a cylinder. It was such a small detail, I figured it would be fine. I mirrored all these pieces and exported the model. Then I repaired it in Repetier Host before moving on. I imported the repaired model back into Blender and overlapped it with two cubes. I then used a Boolean intersection modifier to perfectly split this down the middle. This process is somewhat inefficient, but ends up being easier for me. I printed this as two pieces. I always print the details facing up because it turns out way better, at least on my printer. I used two-part epoxy to attach these pieces together. Since my 3D printer has a glass bed, they fit perfectly. I used zip ties to hold the pieces together while the epoxy dried, which worked way better than clamps could have. Afterwards, I did a rough pass with my Dremel tool and applied wood filler. I find that putting some putty between your fingers and rubbing it onto the print is a good way to start. Then I use an old clay sculpting tool to help me get in the details and scrape off excess. The spikes on the head did not print well. They were just too small, so I applied a bunch of wood filler, hoping that I could sculpt this while sanding. Hand sanding this was pretty easy, but was time consuming. I used sandpaper and small files for most of this. My general approach is to sand until I can see a bit of the plastic showing through, which means that the wood filler is just in the uneven areas. I tried to sculpt the spikes, but it didn't go well. I decided to shave them off entirely with a sharp knife and move on to priming. I figured it would be fine. I woke up that night at 3 AM and was lying in bed thinking about those spikes. I realized I wasn't going to be able to let it go, so the next morning I was back in Blender. First, I enlarged these spikes so my printer could handle them. I also exaggerated other spiky bits, which turned out okay but could have been more prominent. Most of these tweaks were just a half millimeter, but it did make a small difference. I did modify the shaft to make it a little bit thinner. I noticed it felt a little thicker than I had intended. I replaced this cylinder with a small tooth, which was really simple but felt better. I also adjusted the positioning of these two teeth by a couple of millimeters to space things out better. Afterwards, I printed, glued, and sanded everything on version 2. I'm going to skip all of those details because you've already seen it. This is what the two look like after priming. You can see there's some minor imperfections, which are hard to notice before priming. I'll be addressing those next, but I think it already looks better with the details on the head. I used a chisel to shave off some of these imperfections and sanded it again. It looked pretty good at the end. I'm going to be painting this black, so any remaining imperfections won't be obvious, but I would have done another round of wood filler, sanding, and priming if I had been painting this a metallic color or adding a glossy coat to it. Next came the painting. I'm just using some generic black acrylic paint from Michaels and a cheap brush. I thought about using my airbrush, but I'm currently doing some reorganization and I don't have it set up. One coat of paint provided pretty good coverage, especially compared to the metallic paints that I'm often using. It wasn't perfect, so I did decide to apply another coat. After letting this dry, I applied a spray-on matte sealer to finish the project off. I think this turned out pretty well. It's not as colorful as some of my solo leveling daggers, and it's definitely not as flashy as the Demon King's longsword I was planning to post this month, but still a really nice addition to my solo leveling collection. I'm really glad I went back and redid those details. They're small, and most of you probably wouldn't have noticed or cared, but it would have bugged me. The files are all available on Thingiverse if you want to print your own. I'll put a link in the description. If you enjoyed the video, then please give it a like. It really helps out the channel. If you want to see more of my projects, then subscribe to this channel and check out the playlist that should be on screen now. I've done a bunch of other solo leveling projects, and I have more in the works.